Hello, good evening and welcome to Cross Question, LBC's weekly political panel debate show. We'll be here in LBC's Westminster studio each Wednesday at 8 p.m. on the dot to answer questions from LBC listeners. And as well as listening to us on the radio, you can watch us on Global Player and on LBC's YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds. If you'd like to take part in the show and ask our panel a question, all you have to do is pick up the phone and dial 0345 6060 973. The lines are open now. All previous episodes of the programme are on the Cross Question podcast, and this show will appear there before midnight tonight. At least that's the plan. It's time to introduce our panel. In the studio with me and socially distanced are the Conservative MP for East Surrey and PPS at the Treasury, Claire Coutinho, and the actor Laurence Fox. Joining me for Labour, we have Shadow Pensions Minister Jack Dromey from his Birmingham Erdington constituency, and also former newspaper editor Eve Pollard is in our Leicester Square studio. Welcome to you all. Now, normally I'll go to the first call at this point, but before we do that, last night Boris Johnson gave a prime ministerial address to the nation. Tonight, it's the turn of the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
Good evening. When I was elected leader of the Labour Party, I said I would always act in the national interest. That's why, as the nation continues to fight against this dreadful virus, my priority will always be the same as yours: to save lives and protect our NHS. Sadly, despite all the sacrifices and heroism of the British people, it's clear that we are not through this yet. The picture presented by the government's medical advisors this week was stark and it was clear. Infections are rising. Hospital admissions are increasing. And we know from bitter experience where that can lead. That's why the government had to introduce further restrictions last night. We support this, and I urge everyone to follow the new guidance and the rule of law. While these restrictions are now necessary, they were not inevitable. The return of this virus and the return of restrictions are not an act of God. They're a failure of government. The British people have done everything asked of them, but I'm afraid the government has not. We're a great country. We shouldn't have one of the highest death rates in the world or one of the worst recessions. It's a national scandal that we still don't have a testing system that works or a plan to protect our care homes. It shouldn't be like this. People shouldn't have to travel hundreds of miles to get a test for their child, for themselves, or for their relatives. And we should be able to give our older people the dignity, security, and respect they deserve. The government needs to fix testing fast, because that's the only way we can get control of the virus and prevent further restrictions. And we also need to see a plan B for the economy, because it makes no sense to bring in new restrictions at the same time as phasing out support for jobs and businesses. There was nothing in the Prime Minister's statement last night to protect people's jobs, businesses, or our town centres and high streets. No clarity about what happens when the furlough scheme ends. That's a huge gap and a huge mistake, and it could lead to a wave of job losses this winter. We need a national effort to protect jobs and prevent a second lockdown. So I've offered to work with the Prime Minister to do whatever we can to save lives and protect livelihoods. That offer remains open. My door is always open. The weeks and months ahead will be difficult. And I know that there's real frustration and anger about the mistakes that the government has made in the last few months. But we will get through this. The darkness will lift, A better future is possible for our country. A country built on the values that have held us together during this pandemic. Decency, fairness, opportunity, compassion, and security. A future where Britain is everything it can be. The best place to grow up in, and the best place to grow old in. That's the future I want for my children and for my country. That's why I do this. Together, we can build it.
Sir Keir Starmer there, responding to Boris Johnson's address to the nation last night. Well, let's get some reaction to that from our panel here. Let's go to Claire Coutinho first, Conservative MP and Treasury PPS. The return of the virus is a failure of government. Difficult to argue with that, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the one thing I would say is we're not the only country where this virus is starting to spread again. This is actually happening across countries all around the world. And if you remember the public health messaging that we heard at the beginning, it was always that we would probably expect a second wave in winter. So I would say it's quite tough of Keir, and he likes to say that he's being constructive, to say that the only reason the virus is spreading is the government, when clearly it's happening around the world.
Well, to be fair to him, he has been quite constructive over the last few months, hasn't he? But he's constantly rebuffed at PMQs by Boris Johnson, who blusters his way through it without actually accepting that Keir Starmer is trying to be supportive.
I don't think I've seen a lot of trying to be supportive from where I've been sat on the benches. I mean, I can give you an example. For me, obviously, I work with the Treasury, and I remember when we did the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, Labour's position on that was that this is just a meal deal. Why are we doing it? And they're yet to welcome it. So I think sometimes the constructiveness is more sort of discussed rather than actually delivered.
Laurence Fox, what did you make of what you heard there?
I think it's very difficult to do what Keir is trying to do, which is offer a message of hope, while at the same time blaming people. And I think he should probably, if he wants to offer a message of hope, he should offer us a sustainable and proper way out of this situation, while understanding that this is what viruses do. And there's not, as far as I can understand, I obviously got my epidemiology degree on Twitter.
As did we all.
So as far as I can understand this, as much as this could be a second wave, it could also be the end of the first wave. I don't know. I find it very frustrating, because obviously one has to be very reactive to a pandemic and all of this stuff. But I just need a slight, we will fight this virus in our hospitals and on the beaches type moment from somebody, because we did have a sort of never in the field of from Boris Johnson last night, didn't we? I know, but Boris is always saying never in the field of, isn't he? It's the Boris bluster, this is Boris's way. I wasn't totally into what Keir's doing. I think he's being duplicitous in a way.
Jack Dromey, if we can come to you, it is incontrovertible that we do have one of the highest death rates. I'm not sure whether we've got the worst recession of any other country. He says we need a plan B for the economy, but we didn't hear any details of what he thought should be in that plan B.
Well, first of all, he, I think, throughout has acted rightly so in the national interest, accepting all of the proposals that the government have made in terms of necessary steps, despite the fact that some of those steps have been very unpopular. It's been right to do that. Everything possible is done to save lives. But the simple and sad reality is that we have one of the highest death rates in Europe on the one hand, and we have one of the worst economic collapses of anywhere in the world on the other hand. The whole process has been handled grotesquely by Boris Johnson. And you made a very good point, Iain, is that time and again he has reached out, Keir, to Boris Johnson to say, let us work together, sit down together in the national interest. What does that actually
mean, though? What does that mean? Does he want to be part of a temporary coalition, a government of national unity or something?
I don't think we're talking about a government of national unity. What I think we are talking about is that putting the public interest first, the national interest first, and a coming together. In fact, the TUC have proposed what they call the National Recovery Council. The main emphasis of that is on the economic. But I think it's right that we seek to build a consensus around the steps that require to be taken. But then if one scrutinises, as is our job, the steps taken by Boris Johnson has been catastrophic. The mistakes that were made over COVID, so for example, in relation to being too late to go into lockdown, all of the things that are now legend, a test, track and trace system that absolutely does not work. In the last 48 hours, I've had people from the health service, people from manufacturing, people from schools, who have complained bitterly about the problems that they're having. So it's been a monumental failure that's let the British people down. And
So
likewise on the economy.
So if it's been so grotesque, why has Labour supported it all along?
Supported the measures, for example, lockdown measures, and indeed the further measures that have now been announced to keep the public safe. Because the first duty of any government is the safety, indeed the security of its citizens. So notwithstanding the fact that there has been some criticism of Keir and the Labour Party for endorsing those proposals on public safety, it was the right thing to do. The problem is that Boris Johnson has let the country down by mismanaging what is the worst crisis in our lifetime, arguably since 1945.
Eve Pollard, in the seat of power in the LBC studio in Leicester Square, what did you think of what Keir Starmer had to say there?
Well, I'm slightly sympathetic to Keir Starmer because it must be very boring to finally become the leader of the opposition and have to do a virtual conference. And he obviously found that virtual conference went down quite well because it was full of stateliness and seriousness and saying we're under new management, we're quite different from the Labour leader before. And he's saying I'm supportive, and in some ways he has been very supportive in government. But I think, number one, everybody has a go about how many deaths we have. You cannot compare Britain to Sweden, where I did a lecture tour. There's nobody in Sweden by comparison to Britain. We have far more people. The same is true of France. France has much more land in between cities. It doesn't have many great cities, huge cities as we have. So we're not comparing like with like. I do think the test, track and trace system seems to be all gone to pits, and I don't understand why we didn't follow other countries' examples and just go to the American tech companies who seem to have set it up very well, because there does seem to be a problem in that. But the truth is, we always thought when the colder weather came, this virus would come back, and you just have to hear the figures today: 6,178 more deaths. It hasn't been that bad since the bad days before. Not deaths.
No,
cases.
infections.
Sorry, cases.
Well done.
Sorry,
well done,
sorry. I wrote it down very,
I was going to see my dad.
I'm trying to look at you and look at the camera at the same time. And 37 deaths. But this is creeping higher, and we always guessed COVID seems to like all weathers, I'm afraid, but it particularly likes the cold weather, apparently. And we're following many other countries in Europe.
Just before we go to a break, one word answer from each of you. The NHS COVID-19 app is going to be launched with great fanfare tomorrow. Will you all be downloading it and using it? Claire, I suppose you have to say yes.
I would say yes anyway.
Lawrence?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
Jack?
Celebrating the National Health Service, of course.
I'm not sure it's celebrating it, but Eve?
Yes, yeah, of course, we'll give it a go.
But it is a bit of civic responsibility, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, it's obviously had a difficult birth, but let's hope it does actually add something to the track and trace system. Well, we may have questions on that in a moment. 0345 6060 973. If you'd like to ask our panel a question, if you're not watching us but you'd like to, you can do so on the Global Player and also LBC's YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds. You're listening or watching LBC. It's 8:15.
This is LB.
Hello, very good evening. It's 17 minutes past 8. You're watching and listening to Cross Question on LBC. Our panel: Claire Coutinho, Conservative MP; Laurence Fox, actor; Jack Dromey from the Labour Party; and Eve Pollard, former newspaper editor. Let's go to our first caller, Chris in Richmond. Chris, what's your question, please?
Good evening, panel. My question is this: what will last longer, Boris Johnson as Prime Minister or the coronavirus pandemic?
Oh, no, that's a good one. Jack Dromey.
Well, first of all, I hope that the coronavirus pandemic lasts as short as possible because of the pain that is being suffered as a consequence. I don't want to make that kind of read across to Boris Johnson. I'm not his greatest fan, that's for absolute certain, but I would not, to be frank, link them in quite the same way that you have. Now, having said that, I think the man has become increasingly discredited. He captured the imagination back in December of last year. He won an overwhelming majority. I cannot remember a Prime Minister lose support and confidence on the part of the British people quite as quick as has happened to Boris Johnson. And the reason for that... Has it?
What do you base that on? Because the polls are still showing a narrow Tory lead. It's still, the percentage of the vote is not far off the general election. You see the instant polls reacting to what happened yesterday. 78% of the British public agree with what he decided to announce.
Agree with the measures, and that was absolutely right for the British public so to do. But if one looks, if you want to take the polls, Labour were 22% behind in December of last year, and it's now neck and neck between, for example, Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. I think that Boris Johnson has completely mishandled the crisis, but also I think has been seen to be what he is. But Boris Johnson is not a leader of the country in which the country can have confidence to act in the national interest. Boris Johnson acts in Boris Johnson's interests.
Claire Coutinho, there are rumours that Boris Johnson might be suffering from long COVID, still having the after effects, and I know people that suffer from that, and believe me, no one would wish that on anybody. But if you're Prime Minister, you've kind of got to be functioning at 100%, particularly in crises like this. There is discontent on the Tory benches, isn't there?
Well, I mean, I think the thing I would say is if you look at him at PMQ today, he was on absolutely fighting form, and everyone I spoke to on the Tory benches, thought it was a brilliant performance today. Overall, it's interesting that Labour say they think, this and they think that, but I think it's just another example of Labour being quite out of touch with the public, because actually when you go outside of London and you go and talk to people in different areas, there is a huge well of support for Boris.
I'm assuming that you're going to answer the question by saying that Boris will outlive coronavirus.
Well, I mean,
because it would be quite a big news story if you did.
Well, I very much hope so, because I hope coronavirus also goes away.
OK. Eve Pollard.
I think that actually Boris has he had a sort of weak time, but he just looked great this week in that he does look like he's making decisions. We saw them all at the weekend, spending hours discussing what they should do. Then out came Whitty and Valence, and he reacted yesterday by going straight forward and saying, we've got to do this. And he may well have to go further, because there is we all slightly relaxed in the summer. We did. We started to go, I don't mean we went out, we behaved properly, we did everything we were supposed to do. But the good weather and being in the garden, being in the parks, you saw lots of people in the parks, all behaving perfectly. We almost forgot. We didn't quite forget, because I'm actually shielding somebody. My husband's not too well at the moment. But we relaxed, and now it's come back with this force. And I think most people say it's a nightmare job. It's a terrible thing that he's having to deal with. Any Prime Minister would have a nightmare. And I think most people are supportive of him trying to get rid of this pandemic and trying to save people's lives. And then there are strange things we still don't know about this disease. My son had it in February before we knew it was COVID. He was told yesterday he has no antibodies left. So it's really something that is quite scary, this thing.
Laurence.
I think it's a very unenviable position to be in charge during the middle of something like this. So I think and also, as far as I can tell from my degree in epidemiology from Twitter, they've never invented a vaccine for a coronavirus that works, have they? So one imagines that coronavirus is going to be around longer. I feel for Boris. I find it really sad, actually, when the opposition sit there and use this horrible catastrophizing language, because, this virus doesn't care which political party you're part of. So, to attack and use this very, disastrous, monumental, catastrophic language is like, well, who's that helping? in the end of the day.
Chris in Richmond, answer your own question.
Well, I think the coronavirus pandemic will probably last a lot longer than Boris Johnson's premiership. I don't envy him, but I have to say, I watched last night, not a single word about testing, which frankly, Claire, I find shameful. You know, there is a scandal that 250,000 tests are sitting there waiting to be processed. People got to get the tests they need to go back to work, and not a single word of it yesterday. And he's got to stop promising the moon on a stick and not being able to deliver it. And the other thing is he's got to start taking ministerial accountability. Why has Gavin Williamson still got a job, Claire? Please tell me. Lots of people
that is going off the subject, which we're not going to do. Jack Dromer, you wanted to come back on what Laurence was saying.
Yes, well, I mean, first of all, Eve's point about we relaxed, not least because of the messages from government to relax. Secondly, throughout the period, spring going into the summer, when we badly needed to get it right in terms of a test, track and trace system, we've had an utter fiasco that has let the British people down. And thirdly, Laurence, when you say that we shouldn't be critical, can I just tell you one story from my constituency?
I didn't say we shouldn't be critical. I criticised the language that you used.
Laurence,
it was unhelpful and non-constructive.
So you hear the real world out there. Jean Beattie and Charlie were married for 62 and a half years. He died in a care home in Birmingham because what happened was that thousands of people with COVID infections back in the spring were taken out of hospital environments and put back into care homes, as a consequence of which thousands died. So forgive me if I say this, there has been very serious consequences. And if you were to see the kind of pain, like, for example, Jane Roach from my constituency, whose
Thank you very much for telling me about the real world. I buried my mother in this pandemic.
5 days later. And they are bitter about it. And what they want, understandably, for a proper inquiry to learn the lessons so that as we go into a second potential lockdown, that we don't make the mistakes this time that were made last time.
Do you want to respond?
Well, you know, what's the point in patronising me about what the real world is like? As I just said, I buried my mother during this pandemic. I don't wish to walk around turning around to people emoting about it and trying to make political points about it. I wasn't criticising that. I was criticising your choice of language. And what people want is leadership, positivity and future. That's what people want to be presented with. They don't want to be presented with all of this language. It doesn't help anyone. You're scoring political points. For what reason? It doesn't make any difference.
Chris, thank you for your question. Let's move on to an entirely different subject now with Martin in Barnsley. Martin, what's your question, please?
Good evening, panel. I want to know how Keir Starmer's going to beat Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, and is he right not to rule out a second Scottish referendum?
Well, he's got to overtake the Conservatives before he can beat Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, I guess. But he has said today that he's failed to rule out approving of a second referendum, which I think among Labour unions in Scotland is going to be quite an interesting discussion, to put it mildly. Eve Pollard, let's start with you.
Well, as you say, he's got to win an election to beat Nicola Sturgeon. And also, Nicola Sturgeon keeps saying she wants this vote. But frankly, I mean, the Prime Minister constantly says, you had a once-in-a-generation vote, you didn't win, we can't keep having votes on independence. And frankly, I think the country's got quite enough to worry about now, apart from this. But it does seem that he's trying to tilt at windmills that really shouldn't be bothering about at the moment.
Claire, now, a slightly strange question for you to answer. How can Keir Starmer beat Nicola Sturgeon? I guess the task is for the Scottish Conservatives to beat Nicola Sturgeon, given that they're in second place ahead of these elections. But if you don't, and the SNP get a majority, surely that would be a mandate for a second referendum.
Well, I mean, I think, I fully disagree with Keir on this, and I think Keir has become a bit of a serial referendum denier. I mean, we saw this with Brexit, right? We had a referendum, he didn't like the result, he wanted to have another one. I mean, when we had that independence referendum, we said this is once in a generation, and I don't count a few years as a generation, personally.
So do you think that the unionist parties in Scotland need to come together, though? Because there will be, given what he said today, there will be Labour supporters who think, well, I need to vote for the party that I think can beat Nicola Sturgeon. And is that Labour in third place? That's an opportunity for you, isn't it?
Well, I mean, as you said, the Conservatives, who of course are a unionist party, are the ones in second place. So obviously I would urge any Scottish people listening to vote for the Conservatives. But I do think if he wants to make a case in Scotland, the thing that Labour needs to do is be present, right? They really haven't been present in Scotland at all. And I think for someone who's been talking about sort of patriotism and security and all of these quite, national issues this week, it's interesting that they have not had much to say on the union.
Martin, you're actually a week early in your question because we have Richard Leonard, the Scottish Labour leader, on the show next week, so you won't want to miss that. Jack Dramey, this is a real challenge for Labour, isn't it, in Scotland? Do you think that Keir Starmer's made the right decision today not to rule out a second referendum?
I don't think he's looking for a second referendum, but the situation is immensely difficult. And in all honesty, I remember Scotland when I fought some great industrial battles in Scotland, for example, against the closure of Forsyth Dockyard, when there was complete Labour hegemony in Scotland. And it is extraordinary how over the years, trust and confidence in the Labour Party ebbed away. And there's no question of it, there is a massive challenge to the Labour Party in Scotland. Now we have to rise to that challenge. Incidentally, there's also a challenge to the Conservative Party because one reason the SNP have done so well is because of that anti-Tory feeling in Scotland. Going forward at the next stages is that I don't think we should set out down the path of the breakup of the United Kingdom. I think at a time like this, with the massive economic, social and health problems facing our country, that we best stand together. Now, that you have an intelligent debate around this, and I think Keir is encouraging that to happen. You have an intelligent debate, yes, but that you set out to embark down the road of the breakup of the United Kingdom, no.
But there are people in your party who, this isn't how they would describe it, but they kind of think Labour needs to become a bit of an SNP light, to sort of tip a wink at independence, and that's the only way to get people back from the SNP. I suspect that's not your view.
No, I understand some of the points that lie behind that, because again, if we're being very frank, Paul, is that from that era that I remember vividly, of Labour hegemony in Scotland, what the SNP did was to capture really quite brilliantly the sort of social democratic nationalist zeitgeist in Scotland, and they outflanked the Labour Party. Now, we've got to learn some profound lessons from what has happened, but is our preferred outcome the breakup of the United Kingdom? No.
Okay, Laurence.
I think for Keir Starmer to beat anyone at anything, he's probably going to have to not go on national television and label the entire country and union racist, which is what he did last night.
How?
Well, that's what he said. He said he was challenging systemic racism in England and structural inequality and stuff, which is part of the critical race theory. Any structural inequality is a result of racism. It's essentially what he was saying last night on the thing, and he should probably get off his knees.
Okay, well, you're referring to when he took the knee in his office. Right, Martin, what's your own diagnosis?
Well, if he has a Scottish second referendum and they get independence, the left side of politics have just robbed themselves of 55 seats, so therefore Boris Johnson's majority would work out at about 130. So therefore, Labour will never win again. And what a brilliant campaign slogan, vote Labour, get Nicola Sturgeon. And she terrifies voters down here. So he must beat her.
Claire Coutinho would be happy. Permanent Conservative government. I guess you ought to be in favour of Scottish independence on that basis.
I'm afraid I'm a passionate unionist. So no.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. Right, we'll come to more of your calls in just a moment. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's Cross Question. It's 8:32. Serena Farrow has the LBC News headlines.
The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, reply.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:36 on LBC. A quick plug for the For the Many podcast, which I record every week with Jackie Smith. We did an emergency podcast today. We brought back the Wednesday podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast from. Let's go to our next caller, although let me reintroduce my guest first. Claire Coutinho, Conservative MP, the actor Laurence Fox, the Labour MP Jack Dromey, and the former newspaper editor Eve Pollard. Ashish is in Croydon. Ashish, what's your question, please? Welcome.
The question is, should the word empire be removed from MBE?
Now, I don't know why, but I'm going to go to Laurence first.
Hi. In my view, absolutely. Yeah, I think it should. I think we've got this very old narrative going on in the conversation going on in our country that is that the world was fine, everyone was really nice to each other, then the empire came along and everything went wrong, and now we have to that it was the sort of genesis of bad behaviour. But there were actually some interesting and useful things to do with the empire, like exporting democracy around the world and our language and all of these things. I believe we're custodians of these things, and we need to look back on our past and learn from it rather than trying to obliterate it.
So you think the word empire should stay in
100%? That's just my view. But then, I would take the B out of the first B out of BBC. So, that's where I'm at.
Okay. Jack Dromey.
Well, I take the opposite view. I'm proud that we have the finest public service broadcaster in the world, alongside, of course, LBC in the British Broadcasting Corporation. And I
Neatly
think,
done.
With the greatest of respect, Laurence, by the way, I fundamentally object to you somehow depicting Keir Starmer as being a racist or feeding racism, is that you've got to face up to a simple reality, which is, I'm proud of this country. I'm proud of what our country has achieved over so many years. But to be in denial about the problems to this day, on the one hand, of the second-class status of too many of our citizens simply because of the colour of their skin, or on the other hand, to be in denial of the hurt caused to black people by what happened in the name of this country when we were an empire and engaged in the slave trade. I think it was an utterly shameful part of our history, and the best thing to do in terms of our history is to celebrate what is good on the one hand. So, for example, when our country came together to defeat
we ended the slave trade. Do we celebrate that?
To face up to
white British people
on the other hand, and not brush that under the carpet.
What good, though, would taking the word empire out of that? And if it's such an important thing, why didn't it happen under 13 years of Labour government?
Well, I'm not sure that particular proposal is top of Labour's priorities. But what I want to do is to take head on this nonsense, which says that somehow we should not face up to the fact that to this day in our country we have the unacceptable in terms of racism and prejudice, and that in our history most people had nothing to do with it, but in our history there were terrible things that were done in the name of the British Empire, and going back to the days of the slave trade in particular, it's a matter of shame. And so I warmly welcome the fact that at last we're facing up to this, and it's widespread now across society.
All right, Claire.
So, I used to work in social justice issues. I massively care about inequality in this country. And when I think of those disadvantaged people that I worked with, I cannot think a single one of them who would be helped by us removing the word empire. I mean, what does this do? What does this change? And, I think when we talk about the shame of the empire, I think I'm the only one on the panel, I would say, whose ancestors probably lived under the empire in India, which is where my parents are from. I think that we never talk about the other side of it. We don't talk about William Wilberforce. We don't talk about the fact that we ended slavery, that we campaigned across Europe. We give a very one-sided view, which is filled with shame of this country, when actually we were one of the leading lights to end some of these practices.
But do you think that empire is properly understood? Is it taught properly in our schools, for example? Yeah. Do we have a sort of rather rose-tinted view of the British Empire?
I mean, I think most people probably don't spend a great deal of time thinking about the empire.
But should we not? I mean, we learn about the causes of the the Second World War.
No, so
Should we not be learning about our own history?
So I totally agree, and schools can teach it now, and I think it's quite right that we teach people an integral part of the history, and I'm really for that, and I've done a lot of reading on it, and I think it's very much the case that we should educate people as opposed to obliterate things from history.
Eve Pollard.
I sort of agree with Claire. I think if it offends people, and if it really does, I think it's rather like Land of Hope and Glory. I remember having a discussion just like this and saying, actually, you should really listen to the words because they're about freedom. They're not about creating slaves, and there should be a national discussion. What I sort of object to is people sort of come along, and it's the Twitter noise, isn't it? It's the loudest voice that says we should get rid
Laurence
of our...
has got a degree in that.
Well,
I've got a degree in offending people, yeah.
but I mean,
on Twitter.
It's if it really offends people, then we should have a national discussion. I also agree that there should be more education about the bad bits of the empire and the good bits of the empire. But we're probably doing things right now that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will disapprove of. Lessons are learned. History is history. And if you obliterate it, then people won't remember anything. They won't remember the good or the bad, and eventually they won't remember the good either. I mean, I don't care that much, but I mean, I just think it's just too easy to say, let's get rid of it.
Is it right, Laurence, to judge people from the 18th century by the standards that society holds nowadays?
Absolutely not. Because as was so brilliantly pointed out, it probably, when they invent some genetic meat substitute, which we'll all be eating in 50 years from now, they'll be tearing down the statues of those that massacred pigs and cows. It's ridiculous. I'm again listening to Mr. Dromey, who I imagine we're probably not going to go out on a date at any point.
I'm sure he'll be relieved by that.
I'm so utterly and totally fed up with this nation hating, and I'm so utterly fed up with not looking.
He doesn't hate the nation.
He hates the nation. He hates that. He can't bear it. You can't bear it. He's ashamed of the nation, and he thinks the BBC is good, and the BBC is ashamed of the nation as well, and we're just being told relentlessly how dreadful we are. You use the word shame. It's a shame. And it's like, well, it was a shame 200 years ago. It's not a shame now. We solved slavery.
Jack?
Well, I think that's fundamentally wrong. My dad came as a navvy from County Cork in Ireland. He arrived in London and couldn't find lodgings because on the windows of lodging houses was no dogs, no Irish. He then joined the British Army in the Second World War and fought for our country. He's been proud of his Irish background, proud of his British identity, sadly now dead, all his life. Not to face up to the ugly in our history is fundamentally wrong.
Do you see those signs now?
And as for this idea about the slave trade had somehow good aspects to it, this was millions that were...
No one has
said
that. Come on.
Nobody said that.
Got a good aspect.
Well,
I was just saying we solved that. England played a crucial part in ending the slave trade.
They did.
So why don't we teach our children that and teach them that slavery was appalling, rather than just teach them to be ashamed of the very country that they're going to have to grow up and thrive in? It's appalling. It's got to stop.
You're objecting to those who were challenging learning precisely those lessons, and that is fundamentally
I've not said that. I've not objected to anything.
Those lessons need to be learned. Millions were...
I agree with you.
Many were...
I agree with you.
On that note of agreement, okay, Jack, let's get a quick word from Ashish, who asked the original question. A very spirited discussion there, Ashish. Answer your own question, please.
Okay, all empires around the world did evil things. The Ottoman Empire massacred millions of Armenian Christians. So every empire has its good and bad points. I just think since the Black Lives Matter movement has started, with very noble intentions, it's gone AWOL, it's gone uncontrollable. Now they want Winston Churchill's statue taken down. They want, Land of Hope and Glory lyrics taken down. What's next? The Queen can't wear the crown because the Kohinoor diamond in the crown was stolen from India? I mean, what is next?
Quickly, Eve, you want to come in?
Well, I only want to say all my grandparents were murdered by the Nazis for the obvious reason. And every single country has done appalling things, still are doing appalling things. Actually, if you read about things going on in the Middle East, in Africa, there are lots and lots of countries who would long long to be having this discussion about what we are going to do and how we should name things and all the rest of it. I agree with Jack. Education's terribly important, and we probably don't educate our kids enough about what we have done in the past. But history is history, and you cannot compare what happened 200 years ago, probably even 100 years ago, to what will happen now. And as I say, our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be horrified we're using fossil fuel in cars and eating meat and all sorts of other things we've never heard of. We have to progress, but we have to progress together and united. This is a great country, and all I hear is moans about it instead of saying, I mean, out there, London is full of cars taking people to dinner. I think that's good because hospitality has to survive. I'll be interested when I go back if all those cars are off the road and everybody's in at 10 o'clock.
Well, that's next week's phone-in, probably. We'll have more from our
LBC.
It's 10 to 9 on LBC. We're going to extend cross-question this week to 9:15. Keir Starmer, we had on at the beginning of the programme with his statement, so we thought it only fair to give our panel as much time as normal. So do keep your calls coming. Lots actually coming in at the moment. 0345 6060 973. If you've only just tuned in, why? We have Claire Coutinho with us, Conservative MP, the actor Laurence Fox, Jack Dromey, Labour MP, and Eve Pollard, former newspaper editor. Our next question comes from Amanda in Brighton. Hi, Amanda, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Iain and panel. How do the panel think the hospitality curfew will make a difference?
It's a good question, that, actually, because you think, well, just because you close at 10, why would that actually reduce infections? Claire Coutinho.
Well, instinctively as a Conservative, I don't like having restrictions. I don't like having curfews. But if you think about the things that we're asking people to do, whether it's the rule of 6 or it's, hands, space, face, we do know that after 10 p.m, actually, those kind of things are harder to do. People slip a little bit.
Because you're a bit merry.
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. You get a bit friendly. But I
speak for yourself. Only an hour to go.
But I think that the key thing here is that we actually do have a country which has done this, which is Belgium, and we know that it has worked successfully there. So we do have a country comparison to look at.
Oh, well, that's interesting, because I hadn't heard that before. So how long has this been going on in Belgium? How do we know that it works?
Well, so the scientists have looked very carefully, as you imagine they would, at what's happening there. And the evidence shows that actually if you curfew after 10 p.m, you can reduce some of the spread that seemed to be happening in these sort of locations. So
it's not necessarily the fact that people are close together, it's also the fact that they're taking alcohol, and that's why I don't know if this is just in Wales or whether it's in England too, but certainly Wales are banning the sale of alcohol in supermarkets after 10 o'clock as well. Is that happening in the rest of the country, do you know?
Not that I've seen, but I think the important thing is in pubs and restaurants after 10 p.m, the issue isn't people buying alcohol by itself, it's the fact that they don't then do hands and space and rule of 6, all these other rules.
Okay. Eve Pollard, what's your view on this curfew?
Well, we'll see. I mean, it's interesting that it has worked in Belgium, but I mean, I think it also is a way, frankly, of clearing the streets. I mean, I think you've got police. I mean, there was a drama, wasn't there, a few weeks ago when a crowd was in Carnaby Street, and a policeman said very sweetly, he said, I think when people are drunk, they don't really understand about social distancing. And I thought, yes, that's logical. So I think the feeling is, A, you can't stand up and have a drink. You have to sort of sit down and probably eat in a pub. And we all know that does make a difference to your alcohol intake. And secondly, the police can see that people can get on public transport, they can go home, there won't be parties. I mean, we all know bad things happen after 10 o'clock at night. My mother always told me that, which is obviously got to be true. But it's...
Did you take any notice, though, Eve?
Of course not. Don't be silly. I worked in Fleet Street. But if the truth is that it allows the police, who've got a difficult job enough as they have, to say to people, look, I'm glad you've had a lovely dinner, please move on, please go home, and that's the end of the night. And I guess if we get used to that, maybe we'll see the figures. I mean, this is going to be tested by what happens to the COVID rate, isn't it?
Laurence?
The problem seems to be, from people I know, the man who has the boozer down the road, is that he can't have a second sitting because it's more difficult to have a second sitting. So I think that is to a bunch of people who've already been paying rent all the way through when their businesses are being closed, to now be told just as they're getting back on their feet that they're not going to be able to fit in a second sitting necessarily, I think is extremely sad for them. And it is, I don't know, I mean, it's quite a middle class virus, isn't it, in terms of the fact that it doesn't go to Black Lives Matter protests, it works on Greenwich Mean Time, and it goes to the boozer for a couple.
Jack?
Well, 3 points. I mean, first of all, I think that this step, like the other steps announced yesterday, have to be supported. Only time will tell, Iain, if it goes far enough, but I think it has to be supported. Secondly, following on from that, is I think we have a duty as parliamentarians to do, and I'm sure Claire will have been doing exactly the same thing, is to encourage, give leadership, the people that we represent, that they should not put themselves at risk, neither should they put their fellow citizens at risk. But then thirdly, there are significant problems that arise. I mean, they range from, on the one hand, enforcement by the police service, and there's a lively debate going on about how best that is managed, to, on the other hand, the consequences for workers and for businesses of this. And there's no question of it. There are significant consequences, and that's why it's right that one has, and on a continuing basis, measures in place that help. And that's why I hope that when the announcement is made by the Chancellor tomorrow in terms of what, for example, follows the job retention scheme, that will have continuing employment support, because that will be key, not least because of the impact of measures of this kind.
Amanda, would you like to have a word? What do you think of the curfew? I think we've lost Amanda. Let's go to Tim in Hammersmith, who sent in a text. He says, should Kate Green be sacked for her not letting a good crisis goes to waste comments? Kate Green is Labour's Shadow Education Secretary, and she was speaking to a Labour Connect event, and she made these comments, and people have said, well, they're reminiscent of Joe Moore in 2001 on 9/11, a good day to bury bad news. Jack Dromey, there have been calls for her to be sacked. Lisa Nandy apologised for these comments on Kate Green's behalf. I'm not sure what she made of that. What's your view?
I think Kate is a thoroughly decent woman. I think what she said was not right. She has apologised for that. I think that in no circumstances should we ever see political advantage out of a crisis of this kind. And I know she feels that way, and that she grieves for the fact that she said something she shouldn't have said. But she's a fundamentally decent woman doing a very good job.
But you kind of knew what she was saying. I mean, it sounds bad, but actually, if you read the whole quote in context, I mean, she wasn't actually saying anything that bad, was she?
It's certainly been embellished by some of the media and social media coverage. But the reason Lisa said what she said is reflecting how Kate feels. She regrets it. But I stress again, I think she is outstanding. She's a great parliamentarian. And I think now we move on at the next stages.
OK. Laurence, you weren't convinced by that answer?
No, I was just laughing at you shouldn't, the political advantage line just made me giggle because it wasn't hypocritical at all. No, she shouldn't be sacked. Isn't that what politicians do? And also, let's stop being so sensitive. It's the kind of machination I'd expect from a politician.
It's what happens in party politics. So somebody makes a comment that could be misconstrued in some way and the other side leap on it. Have you ever been in that situation yet, Claire, in your political career where you've said something which your opponents have leapt on?
No, thankfully I haven't, but I'm sure I will, to be honest. And,
feel free to do it on this programme.
But I personally, I'm not one for calling summarily for people's sackings. I think people make mistakes, they can apologise. I don't think it was great language, and I think my issue with it is it does speak to a greater truth with this is ultimately the heart of Labour's policy right now. What they are trying to do is make political hay out of, a very difficult situation.
Well, they're holding the government to account. That's the job of an opposition.
But I think it's not quite just holding the government to account, which I think you're right is good and opposition does. I think if you look at, some of the language that Jack was using earlier, catastrophic failures, or some of the claims that they've made,
there have been catastrophic failures. He wasn't embellishing. There have been catastrophic failures.
But I think the way that they use that language is basically to make a political point, to say we would never have done this if we weren't in your position. And actually, we don't know that counterfactual. We don't know what Labour would have done. We don't hear any policies from them. We don't hear what they would do in terms of solving the challenges they raise.
Eve?
First of all, this is part of this adversarial aggression, which gets people nowhere. But I agree with Claire. I'd like to hear more ideas and suggestions. Tomorrow, we've got Rishi Sunak, who's going to have to come up with something that is going to save our hospitality business, because of course that's very important.
Hold your horses on that one,
all right,
Eve,
sorry,
because
I'll hold
I think we have a question coming up on that.
There are hundreds of horses here. I'll tell them to shut up. But he's got to do it. And what would be really interesting, as a person who works and always worked in huge offices with lots of ideas, is to have Keir Starmer and some of the staff, some of the opposition, come up with good ideas, come up with suggestions. I mean, we all rely on the hospitality business, whether it's getting a coffee at the corner or a 3-course meal for a birthday. These people and these companies, it's not just the people who work there, it's the people who are running it, people who put their life savings into these companies. They need to be looked after.
Okay.
Aviation, all sorts of others. I've got my horses getting restive. Sorry.
Not at all. We look forward to a bit more because we're extending Cross Question till 9:15 this evening, so keep your calls and questions coming. You're listening to LBC. It's 9 o'clock. Hello, a very good evening. It's 9:04. We've got a specially extended Cross Question tonight until 9:15. With me in the studio in Westminster, Laurence Fox, the actor, Claire Coutinho, Conservative MP, and in the seat of power in Leicester Square, it's Eve Pollard, and Jack Dromey joins us live from his constituency in Birmingham. So let's go to another caller. David is in Enfield. David, hi, what's your question, please?
Good evening, everybody. How would the panel advise the Chancellor to restore balance to public finances? The budget deficit this year is going to be around £300 billion, and the national debt now exceeds £2 trillion, which is the highest level since the war, and exceeds our national income. Would they increase taxes? Would they increase taxes, or would they extend the period of austerity?
Claire, well, obviously we've got the statement from the Chancellor tomorrow. I'm sure you're going to tell us exactly what he's going to say, not. But David makes a very fair point there. Rishi Sunak has been very popular so far because he's been handing out the sweeties, but he's actually going to have to take them back again at some point, isn't he?
Yes, he's been very candid about this, because obviously we have spent a lot of money this year, and I think for any Conservative, you would never have expected to spend this amount of money. But actually, if you look at everything that everyone said, we had to do that. We were in a pandemic. It was really important that we tried to preserve as much of the economy as we could, and we tried to do that in as fiscally as reasonable a way as we can. But over the long term, it is really important that we do have sound public finances.
You say as reasonably as you can, but we heard today that 5% of the DWP budget is being wasted either because of waste or fraud, and that's a hell of a lot of money, isn't it, that's being wasted there. We know that £3.5 billion has been either falsely claimed or wrongly or fraudulently claimed through the furlough programme. That's not being careful with public money, is it?
Well, I think on the furlough money in particular, there's obviously a process in order to try and deal with that. But the one thing I will say is we were very candid about this at the time. At the time, the imperative was to act quickly and to act at scale. And I think if we had been in the weeds trying to sort out details, it would have taken months and months to actually deliver this cash, which was desperately needed to people. So yes, in any policy that you do when you're trying to react to a crisis, there's going to be some negatives to it. But we went into it with eyes open, and we were very open with the public about those concerns.
And what advice have you given the Chancellor, if you can reveal this, for what he should be doing now? Because obviously people look at the furlough programme and they think, well, it's supposed to come to an end at the end of October, but we're now told that this is going to go on for 6 months. Surely he's got to do something to either replace it or extend it.
Well, I mean, it's, for the Chancellor to set out tomorrow what he's going to say in this, and it'd be wrong, obviously, for me to do it
well,
here.
I had to try.
But what I will say is, it's not something I advise him. It's something that he said multiple times. I know very much to be true, that the thing that keeps him up at night is jobs. And that's quite right. I think that's where the focus should be, and that's what we're all trying to work on.
Jack Dromey, what's your answer to David's question?
Bold measures, I agree actually, Claire, on this. Bold measures were necessary to avoid what would have been an economic collapse. Going forward, austerity is not the answer. I mean, we had 10 years of it, and part of the problem, by the way, in responding to the challenge of COVID was the extent to which public services had been run down. Saying to the British people, reeling in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, that they should pay more taxes, it's not exactly going to be the most popular view either. I think crucially, it is about how do we grow the economy at the next stages. And that means a substantial investment. I'll just give you one example. The French are investing £7 billion in their automotive industry and giving people €6,000 if they buy a non-polluting car. The Germans have put aside £50 billion to boost their automotive industry and their aerospace industry. It's bold measures like that which are see public investment in the short term, but growth in the medium term, which I think are absolutely necessary. And just one final thing is that when people talk of costs, and I understand, by the way, these are mind-boggling figures, had there not been steps taken to keep people in work, then the costs of unemployment would have been so much greater. In my own constituency, we've got 16,700 people on furlough. Unemployment's just gone up by 58% since March of this year. I think, therefore, that we do everything possible to keep people in work, but then to grow, to rebuild the economy with a serious industrial strategy is of the highest importance.
In terms of the furlough programme, would you like the Chancellor to extend it and essentially keep it as it is, but for a longer time? Or do you think he should axe it and look at particular sectors to provide support?
There's been, I think, a really quite good debate on this because the furlough scheme, there's no question of it, had great strengths. There were problems about the phasing out of furlough and the concerns being expressed, by the way, by companies and trade unions over that. I think the debate now has moved on to what should replace furlough, because at one stage what was being said is, well, that's it, end of October, that's it, no more measures of that kind. Now, for example, has been looked at is German-style arrangements of subsidised part-time employment. Now, that's one of different possibilities that have been the basis of discussion, including, incidentally, our front bench have been involved in discussion, but also the unions, the industry, the voices of the world of work. But one thing that unites all those voices is there may be different methods of wage subsidy, wage support. But what is crucial is that you have such subsidy and support, because otherwise you lose 1 million and more jobs in a matter of weeks and months.
Eve Pollard, what do you think the Chancellor either should do or will do tomorrow? And will it be enough?
Well, enough is quite hard to say, and I imagine he'll allow himself some leeway to change things. I think if the furlough system is open to such fraud, he might rethink that, and I think that Jack's mention of the bonus system, the subsidised part-time employment, might well come in. And I think certain sectors, without doubt, need help before all others. I mean, I think that you've got to look at things like hospitality, you've got to look at aviation, you've got to look at retail, which of course is down the tubes really, because we're all ordering everything online. But I also think you've got to negotiate some growth. I'm not sure I'd put money into the automotive industry, since we live in a capital city where you can't drive anywhere and you have a congestion charge 7 days a week, which irritates me as a Londoner, because it's not helping.
Congestion tax, but
it's not. But it's not helping anybody get round this city, and actually puts people off London, I would think. But yes, we do have to work together, and I'm imagining he is he's a clever chap. I imagine he'll think of some original ideas, but they may not be the end. It just depends on how fast this pandemic takes over. I'm hoping that they think that if we act now and we act fast, maybe we'll sort of nip it in the bud. But whether that will be true or not, I won't know for a while. Others will.
Laurence, what would you like to see in the sector that you're most familiar with, in the theatre, television, for musicians? Because there's so many people having a really, really tough time, and you think one of the worst outcomes for this whole pandemic is if London loses its theatre land, and it could do, couldn't it?
Yeah, very sadly. I mean, you only have to work in the theatre, even in the West End, to realise how hard up these places are, and then you imagine going out into the provinces where you also work and see how I don't know, I mean, it was really bad when there was no pandemic. So who knows what's...
And he announced there was the £1.57 billion sort of rescue package for the arts and culture, but I don't know where that's gone or which parts of the sector are going to get that money. But do you think that there will be a massive package of measures that he announces tomorrow, not just for your area, but more generally?
I've no idea, because I haven't got a Twitter degree in economics, which is unfortunate. But I mean, I've got
grade at A level, so I can.
Okay, well, I did read. I'm going to make a huge mistake here, which is try and remember a stat. But I did read something like benefits payments are going up by over 150% or something like that, and I just thought I could be totally wrong on that. So sorry in advance, but it is the people that would usually be able to move around and make money, it's that quiet little part of the economy that's just really sad. I really feel for everybody, especially with the new restrictions. I just think I'm poor. Ugh.
Right, David, do you want to come back?
Yes, I'd be much bolder than your panel. I would aim to secure a major boost in consumption. I'd cut that. I'd cut income tax for the lower earners, because consumption is 70% of our national income. Now, that will increase the national debt in the short term, but we can borrow money now close to zero. The bond prices might even go negative in the next 12 months. And then hope that boost in consumption investment will start growth. So I would keep the furlough scheme going for 6 months and reevaluate the whole thing at the end of the year, assuming I cut taxes in the next couple of weeks.
Well, maybe you should be Chancellor, David. Thank you very much indeed for that diagnosis. A final text question from Dennis in East Ham, who says, Harry and Meghan have been named two of the most influential people in the world. Who in public life has the biggest influence on you? Laurence.
Does public life... public life just means famous, doesn't it?
Someone we've heard of, yeah.
Okay, my dad. He was a massive movie star. He gave up his career to pursue his true goals, and he gave his life to his family, and still does to this day. Legend. Lovely answer. Claire, you have to say your mum now, don't you?
I'm going to say Sir Keir Starmer. Because
What?
One of the reasons I became an MP was because I was so fed up of people not delivering on Brexit.
Well, that's an interesting answer. Jack Dromey, beat those two answers.
Two sides of the same coin. I sometimes say since Churchill was a boy, and there was a veteran rebuilding process in the 1980s of the Labour, and that was led by Neil Kinnock, a remarkable man on the one hand, and the man in whom I've got confidence to finish the job this time round, taking Labour back to government, is Keir Starmer on the other.
I'm so disappointed you didn't say Harriet. Eve Pollard.
I was going to say Harriet because I've known her for years.
Sorry, Eve, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say Harriet. Harriet will be one of them. I think the Queen, we finally realised that she actually can bring us together. She said some good things. She's 94. She has never stepped foot wrong. Interestingly, those two royals, Harry and Meghan, have got involved in politics in America, which the royal family didn't used to do, but obviously they now do. How the world moves on. But I think most of us would think of a parent, wouldn't they? A parent who'd loved us and looked after us.
I think that's probably very true. Or a grandparent, actually.
Yeah.
I think people can probably guess which public figure I would choose, but I'll leave it to you to guess that one. But thank you to all of our panel, Eve Pollard, Jack Dromey, Laurence Fox and Claire Coutinho. Thank you so much for joining us on Cross Question this week. We will be back, of course, next week at 8 o'clock. In a moment, I am going to ask you what you would like the Chancellor to do. The number 0345 6060 973. Should he extend the furlough scheme? What should he do for the 3 million people who've called themselves the excluded, the self-employed, the company directors who've had no help whatsoever during this crisis? Are they at